Thank you, family, for your unwavering support. Please subscribe, leave a like, and share this video with your friends and loved ones. Don't forget to turn on notifications so you'll never miss any of my future videos. Thank you so much for being part of my journey. Now, let's enjoy today's story. Thailand, where ancient tradition intertwines with modern ambition. Amidst the shimmering skyline of Bangkok, where glass towers pierce the heavens and neon lights dance against the night, one empire reigns supreme. Boonruang's family legacy is not merely a corporation, it is a dynasty, a monument to decades of ruthless ambition, strategic brilliance, and untouchable wealth. From the sprawling headquarters that looms over the city like a titan, their influence stretches across industries, banking, real estate, technology, and beyond. Politicians bow in their presence, competitors crumble at their feet, and the nation's economy pulses to the rhythm of their decisions. Yet, beneath the polished veneer of success, shadows lurk. Betrayal simmers in whispered corridors. Greedy hands reach for what is not theirs. And at the heart of it all stands Boonruang, the heir to an empire that could make or break him. Boonruang was born into power, sculpted by expectation, and forged under the relentless weight of legacy. From the moment he could walk, he was groomed to command, his posture straight, his words measured, his mind sharpened like a blade. He was the heir to Thailand's most powerful empire, a kingdom of wealth that touched every corner of industry. On the surface, he was everything a leader should be: disciplined, intelligent, and impossibly composed. Handsome, with sharp, discerning eyes that concealed the storm within. Every move he made, every decision he took, had been rehearsed for years, crafted to perfection under his father's watchful gaze. But beneath the polished exterior lay a man haunted. The absence of his mother was a wound that had never healed, a quiet ache that lingered in the spaces no one could see. Her name was rarely spoken, her memory carefully erased from the grand halls of their empire, yet her absence loomed like a ghost, whispering to him in moments of solitude. And though his father's love had been a fortress against the world, it could not shield him from the silent war he fought within himself, the fear that he would never be enough. Even with an empire at his feet, Boonruang felt the weight of eyes waiting for him to falter, waiting for him to fail. And as his father's throne now sat empty, the world would finally see if he was truly fit to sit upon it, or if he would crumble beneath the burden of expectation. The air inside the private hospital room was thick with the scent of antiseptic and the quiet hum of machines measuring the fading life of Somchair Thanasan, the man who had once seemed invincible. The empire he had built, the wealth he had accumulated, the power he had wielded with unshakable confidence, all of it now meant nothing as he lay weak and frail, his breath shallow, his body betraying the very strength that had defined him. Boonruang sat at his father's bedside, his hands clenched into fists on his lap, his heart pounding with an unbearable mix of grief and duty. He had seen his father command boardrooms, silence rivals with a single glance, and move entire economies with a decision. But now, he was just a dying man, a father slipping away before his son's helpless eyes. Somchair turned his head with great effort, his once powerful voice now a whisper, hoarse yet unwavering. "Boonruang," he said, and the weight of his name on his father's tongue felt heavier than it ever had before. Boonruang leaned in, gripping his father's hand, once firm and steady, now cold and weak. "I'm here, father," he said, his voice tight with restrained emotion. Somchair's dark eyes, still sharp despite the exhaustion sinking into them, bore into his son's. "The company, the empire, I built it for you." A pause, labored breathing. "Not for them." Boonruang knew who he meant. the family members lurking in the shadows, the board members waiting like vultures, the enemies within who saw him as nothing more than an obstacle to be removed. "You were always meant to lead," Somchair continued, squeezing his son's hand with the last of his strength. "Not because you are my son, but because you are strong, because you understand what it takes to protect what is yours. But power is a curse if it is not wielded with honor." He coughed, his body trembling under the effort, but his eyes never left Boonruang's. "Be steadfast, my son. Be unbreakable. They will come for you. They will test you. They will try to take what is yours. Do not let them." Boonruang's throat burned. He swallowed hard, nodding, though every part of him wanted to scream that he wasn't ready, that he couldn't do this alone. "I won't fail you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Somchair gave a faint, tired smile, the last he would ever give. "You are my greatest legacy, Boonruang. Not the company, not the wealth. You." The machines beeped slower, his breath shallower. A final, fragile squeeze of Boonruang's hand, and then silence. Boonruang sat frozen, his father's words still echoing in his ears. "Be steadfast. Be unbreakable. Do not let them take what is yours." The weight of the empire had shifted. The throne was now his. And outside those hospital doors, the wolves were already circling. The moment Somchair's last breath left his body, the balance of power shifted. The patriarch was gone, and the throne he had fiercely guarded was now left to Boonruang, a young king standing alone at the gates of an empire built on steel, sweat, and silent wars. Beyond the hospital's sterile walls, the city roared on, oblivious to the battle that was already beginning in the quiet spaces between words, in the fleeting glances exchanged between those who had waited too long for this moment. In the grand halls of the Thanasin estate, where gold-trimmed chandeliers cast long, stretching shadows across marble floors, whispered conversations bloomed like venomous flowers. Aunts and uncles, cousins with polished smiles, business partners with hands far too clean to be trusted. They gathered beneath the pretense of mourning, dressed in the finest black silk, their faces carefully arranged into masks of sorrow. But behind their downcast gazes, behind the murmured condolences and respectful bows, lay something far more dangerous. A quiet smirk from an uncle with ambitions far greater than his loyalty. A fleeting glance between two executives who had long dreamed of a different leader, one they could control. An aunt's trembling hand tightening over her pearl necklace, as if calculating what was left for her in the empire's fortune. None of them spoke it aloud, but the truth was already understood. Boonruang was alone, and alone meant vulnerable. The throne was his, not by choice, not by hunger, but by blood. Boonruang sat at the head of the long obsidian conference table, the weight of his father's empire pressing down on his shoulders like a silent executioner's hand. The air in the boardroom was thick, heavy with unsaid words, sharpened with veiled hostility. Around him, the faces of the family and executives who had once nodded deferentially at Somchair now watched him with something else entirely. Doubt, disdain, a silent, waiting malice. The Thanasin Empire was a beast of its own, unrivaled, impenetrable, woven into the very economy of Thailand. Luxury hotels stretching across continents, financial institutions that dictated the flow of money, technological innovations that set global trends. From the polished skyscraper that bore the Thanasin name in gold-lettered pride to the elite networks of power it controlled, Boonruang's inheritance was not just vast. It was untouchable, or at least it had been. Now, with his father gone, the cracks beneath the surface were widening, and the vultures who had circled in silent patience were finally descending. "Your father had a way of doing things, Boonruang," his uncle Ratchata said, fingers steepled together in a performance of concern. You'll soon learn that what worked for him may not work for you. It was not advice, it was a threat. Around the table, the board members exchanged glances, small, calculated gestures that spoke louder than words. They saw him as young, unproven, a boy trying to fit into the shoes of a giant. "You must understand," said Anand, one of the longest-serving executives, a man who had once sworn unwavering loyalty to Somchair. "Investors are nervous. They need to know that stability will be maintained, that we are in capable hands." The unspoken meaning was clear. Are we? Boonruang felt the coil of tension in his chest tighten, but his expression remained a mask of indifference. He had spent years watching his father in this very seat, commanding with unwavering authority. Somchair never needed to demand respect. It was given. Boonruang, however, could feel them measuring him, weighing him, waiting for him to stumble. He straightened in his chair, his voice calm but cutting. "The stability of this empire isn't dictated by doubt, gentlemen. It's dictated by execution. We move forward, and we do so decisively." Some of them smirked. Others simply watched, and Boonruang knew they were not convinced. Outside the boardroom, the corridors of the Thanasin headquarters were lined with polished marble, the scent of wealth and power lingering in the air. Employees passed by with lowered heads, whispers trailing behind them. "He's too young. The board will eat him alive. Somchair would have never let this happen." Even in his own empire, Boonruang was a stranger. He walked through the grand halls, past portraits of his ancestors, their gazes cold and unyielding, as if questioning whether he was worthy to stand among them. Then came the first blow. A call from legal. An audit had been triggered, an internal audit. Accounts were being flagged, funds were missing. Someone had moved millions offshore. Boonruang knew exactly what this was. A test, a warning. Someone, maybe several people, were pulling strings behind his back, setting fires in the dark. If he failed to contain them, if he showed even the slightest weakness, they would turn those sparks into a wildfire that would consume everything his father had built. His grip tightened around his phone as he stood before the towering glass window of his office, looking out at the empire he had inherited. He was their king now, and the only thing more dangerous than a kingdom with no ruler was a ruler they did not fear. The empire was bleeding, and the blade was being held by hands he could not see. Boonruang stood in his office, the city of Bangkok sprawling beneath him, neon lights flickering like distant stars. His reflection in the floor-to-ceiling glass was as polished as ever. Tailored suit, composed expression, but beneath the surface, the cracks had begun to form. He had spent years preparing for this role, trained to lead, to command. But nothing, not the lessons from his father, not the years of discipline, had prepared him for the betrayal that lurked in the veins of his own company. The first strike came quietly. A confidential report, anomalies in the financial records, large sums of money siphoned into offshore accounts, disguised under fabricated transactions. Some of the transfers had occurred while his father was still alive, but in the past 2 months, they had increased tenfold. Millions vanished. Boonruang turned the pages of the audit report, his fingers tightening over the damning evidence. The signatures at the bottom of the documents bore his father's name, except they weren't his father's. Forged. The weight of realization settled like ice in his gut. Someone had been moving money. Someone with enough influence to manipulate documents, bypass internal controls, and make it look like Somchair had authorized it. Someone inside his own company. The second strike came with a whisper, a late-night message from a board member's assistant, one who had overheard a conversation she was never meant to hear. They think he's too weak. They're waiting for him to crumble. If the press gets this, it will destroy him before he even begins. He won't last 6 months. Boonruang stared at the words glowing on his phone screen, his jaw clenching. This wasn't just sabotage. This was a calculated, deliberate attempt to dismantle his leadership before it had even begun. The third strike was personal. An unmarked envelope slipped under his office door. Inside, a single photograph, grainy, taken from a distance. Him, sitting in his car. On the back, a message in clean, precise handwriting. "You don't belong here. Step down before it's too late." Boonruang exhaled slowly, the paper crumpling slightly in his grip. His heartbeat was steady, his face unreadable, but something inside him burned. This was no longer just business. This was war. His enemies were no longer shadows in the dark. They were within his walls, wearing the faces of executives who smiled in meetings, board members who offered empty condolences, and relatives. And if they thought he would break, they had underestimated the son of Somcherthanasin. The empire was his, yet it felt like a prison. The Thanasin estate, a sprawling testament to wealth and power, stood silent under the night sky. Gilded chandeliers cast a soft glow against marble floors. The towering windows framed a breathtaking view of Bangkok's skyline, and rare art pieces hung in every corridor, a museum of privilege. But inside, Boonruang sat alone. The grand estate, once filled with the commanding presence of his father, now felt hollow, like an abandoned palace stripped of its soul. The servants moved quietly, their eyes lowered in practiced discretion, never questioning the heir who barely ate, who walked the empty halls in restless silence, who sat in his father's old study long after the world outside had gone to sleep. And there, in the dim glow of the study, his gaze fell upon the large portrait of Somcherthanasin, his father, his mentor, the man whose absence had fractured everything. The weight in his chest was suffocating. I am not him. The thought crept in like poison, cold and relentless. He had been trained for this all his life, taught strategy, discipline, resilience. Yet, now that the throne was his, he felt like a child wearing a crown too heavy for his head. The board distrusted him. The family wanted him gone. The company was unraveling before his eyes, and no matter how hard he fought, no matter how much he tried to hold the pieces together, it was slipping through his fingers. I was never meant to lead. He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, pressing his hands together to stop them from trembling. His mind raced with possibilities, with escape routes he had never dared to consider before. I could walk away, let them take it, leave it all behind. The idea felt like treason, but it also felt like relief. No more whispers of doubt. No more vultures waiting for him to fall. No more burden of proving himself to a world that wanted him to fail. His eyes flickered back to the portrait. His father's gaze was unwavering, even in stillness. Be steadfast. Be unbreakable. Do not let them take what is yours. Boonruang shut his eyes. For a moment, he let himself drown in the suffocating weight of it all. The pressure, the loneliness, the crushing void of knowing he had no one to turn to. But then, slowly, he inhaled, steady, controlled. Walking away was not an option. He would rise. He would fight. He would become everything they swore he couldn't be, even if it destroyed him in the process. Bangkok was alive, pulsing with energy, the night market bursting with color and sound. The scent of sizzling street food clung to the humid air. Grilled satay, fresh mango sticky rice, spices blending into the kind of aroma that felt like home to the city's beating heart. Voices overlapped, merchants calling out their best deals, tourists haggling over souvenirs, laughter spilling into the streets from crowded food stalls. Boonruang moved through the chaos like a shadow, dressed in simple clothes, dark jeans, a fitted black t-shirt, a baseball cap pulled low. He was nearly unrecognizable. Here, in the neon glow of the market, he was not the heir to an empire. He was just another face in the crowd, and for the first time in months, he could breathe. He let the sounds wash over him, the sheer normalcy of it numbing the weight in his chest. No backstabbing board members, no suffocating silence of his empty estate. Just Bangkok, untamed and alive. Then, a sharp yelp, a blur of movement. Boonruang barely had time to register it before a small, brightly colored fruit tumbled against his foot and rolled to a stop. He looked up just as she appeared. Chitachi. She wasn't like anyone else in the market. She was different. Tall, dark-skinned, her natural curls pulled into a high ponytail. She wore a simple white sundress, the fabric swaying as she moved, a crossbody bag slung at her side. But what struck him most was the energy around her, bright, effortless, alive. She wasn't lost in the rush of the market like the other foreigners. She belonged here, as if she carried her own rhythm, her own light. She grinned, huffing as she bent down to pick up the runaway fruit, a dragon fruit, its pink skin standing out vividly against the pavement. "Wow, you have some fast reflexes," she laughed, looking up at him, eyes warm with amusement. "I was trying to stop that thing before it made a grand escape." For a second, Boonruang just stared. She was talking to him, not bowing, not calculating, not waiting for something, just talking. His mouth opened, then closed. A beat of silence. She blinked, tilting her head. "You good?" He blinked, forcing himself to speak. Yeah. Smooth. Chitachi let out a small laugh. "Great, because I could really use a hand right now." She gestured toward the small fruit stall nearby, where an elderly Thai woman was giving her an unimpressed look, arms crossed. Chitachi turned back to Boonruang with a sheepish smile. "I kind of don't have enough cash." Boonruang arched an eyebrow. "You're negotiating with no money?" "I had a plan," she defended. "It was just a flawed one." He couldn't help it. A small, quiet chuckle escaped him. The first real one in months? Still half amused, he pulled out a few baht from his pocket and handed it to the vendor, who took it with a satisfied nod. Chitachi exhaled in relief. "You, my friend, are a lifesaver." She beamed up at him, bright and genuine, as if he had just done something far more important than buying a piece of fruit. Something about it disarmed him. For the first time in a long time, someone looked at him and saw just a man. Not an heir, not a leader, not a broken king in a crumbling empire. Just Boonruang. And for the first time in a long time, that was enough. Boonruang wasn't sure why he kept finding himself near the market again. He told himself it was coincidence. The food stalls offered a change from the sterile perfection of his estate. The energy of the city provided a rare escape. But deep down, he knew the truth. It wasn't the market he was drawn to. It was her, Chitachi. There was something about the way she carried herself. Effortless, unshaken by the world around her. She walked with a confidence that wasn't boastful, but natural. It wasn't arrogance, it was certainty. A kind of peace Boonruang had never known. And that peace was intoxicating. She wasn't intimidated by him. She wasn't trying to impress him. She wasn't looking at him like a prize or a rival. She just was. He watched from a distance at first, catching glimpses of her haggling with street vendors, laughing over small things, her hands animated when she spoke. She moved like someone who had never doubted her place in the world. Then, one evening, as he lingered near a food stall, she caught him staring. She grinned. "If you keep following me like that, I'm going to start charging you rent." Boonruang blinked. For a moment, he had no response, no calculated reply, No perfect script to follow. She tilted her head, amusement dancing in her dark eyes. Or, you could just admit you enjoy my company. Something about the way she said it, not as a tease, not as a challenge, just as a simple fact, made his carefully constructed walls crack, just a little. Instead of denying it, he exhaled a small chuckle and shook his head. You're very bold. And you're very mysterious, she countered, taking a bite of a fresh mango slice. You show up here like you're running from something, but pretend you're not. The words hit deeper than they should have. Boonruang hesitated, his usual mask slipping. For the first time in a long time, someone had seen him. Not the polished CEO, not the reluctant heir, just the man beneath the burden. Chitachi didn't press, but he could feel her watching him, waiting. Not pushing, not demanding, just offering space. And strangely, he wanted to fill it. He found himself speaking before he could think. I come here because it's quiet. She raised an eyebrow, glancing around at the chaotic market, where voices rang out in rapid Thai. Street performers played instruments, and vendors shouted their best deals. Wow, she said, deadpan. You must live in a war zone, if this is your idea of quiet. A rare smile tugged at his lips. She had a way of disarming him. Then, her expression softened. You're carrying something heavy. The words weren't intrusive. They weren't a demand. They were an observation, spoken with the kind of sincerity that made something twist deep in his chest. Boonruang swallowed. He should have shut it down. He should have walked away. But instead, for the first time, he let the silence between them stretch, not as a barrier, but as an invitation. And Chitachi, patient and unshaken, waited. That night, for the first time and longer than he could remember, Boonruang wasn't alone. Boonruang sat across from Chitachi at a quiet corner of the market, the dim glow of hanging lanterns casting flickering patterns across their table. The usual hum of the city was alive around them, but tonight, he was only aware of her. The way she spoke, the quiet certainty in her voice, the way she met his gaze without hesitation. She was different, and she made him think in ways he didn't want to. So you really believe that? He asked, his tone edged with skepticism. Chitachi smiled, dipping a piece of fried banana into sweet coconut cream. Believe what? That God is watching over you. That faith, he scoffed slightly, shaking his head, that it gives you strength. She didn't flinch at his dismissal. She didn't rush to defend herself. She simply wiped her fingers with a napkin and met his gaze with unwavering confidence. Yes, she said, I do. Boonruang exhaled sharply, leaning back. Faith is for people who need something to hold on to. She tilted her head. And you don't? His jaw clenched. He should have shut down the conversation right then. But something about her calmness, her ease, her absolute certainty, made walking away impossible. You don't know what I've seen, he muttered, his voice quieter now. What I've been through. Chitachi's eyes softened, but she didn't offer empty platitudes. Instead, she reached for her drink, swirling the ice in the glass. You think I don't know suffering? She asked, her voice steady. You think my life has been easy? Boonruang frowned, caught off guard. She exhaled, resting her elbows on the table. I've been in places where I had nothing but faith. When I was a kid, my mom and I had nights where we barely had food, and all we could do was pray that God would provide. I've had moments where people looked at me, because of my skin, my background, and made me feel like I didn't belong. I've been in danger, and the only thing I had to hold on to was God. Her voice didn't waver. There was no bitterness in it, no anger, just truth. And did he answer? Boonruang asked, his tone laced with quiet challenge. Chitachi didn't hesitate. Every single time. Boonruang scoffed, looking away. I don't believe in things I can't see. Chitachi smiled, but it wasn't mocking. It was knowing. You believe in loyalty. You believe in honor. You believe in responsibility. You can't see those things, but you live by them. That made him pause. She leaned forward slightly, her gaze locking onto his. You believe in things, Boonruang. You just don't know it yet. His throat tightened. He had spent his entire life relying on logic, on discipline, on the things he could control. Faith? Faith was unpredictable. Faith meant trusting something other than himself. He wasn't ready for that. But the way she looked at him, the unwavering light in her eyes, for the first time, the doubt wasn't hers. It was his. And the seed had been planted. The market had begun to quiet, the late-night rush giving way to the hushed murmurs of lingering vendors packing up their stalls. The air was cooler now, the sounds of the city more distant. Boonruang sat across from Chitachi, but tonight he wasn't focused on the world around them. He was focused on her. There was something different in her eyes tonight. Not the usual brightness, not the teasing confidence that always disarmed him. This was something deeper, something raw. She exhaled slowly, staring down at the untouched drink between her hands. When she spoke, her voice was calm, but there was an undercurrent beneath it, a quiet strength built from pain. I was never supposed to be here, she started, her tone steady. Not in Thailand, not even in this life, if my father had his way. Boonruang frowned, watching as her fingers traced the condensation on the glass, her expression unreadable. My father wanted a son, she continued. In his mind, daughters were nothing more than burdens. He believed a boy would carry his name, his legacy, but instead, he got me. And for that, he never forgave my mother. She paused, inhaling sharply. When I was 2, my mother was sent away, banished from her own home. My father's family said she had failed her duty. She wasn't given a second chance. No matter how much she begged, no matter how much she tried to prove her worth, she was nothing to them because she couldn't give them what they wanted. Boonruang felt something tighten in his chest. Chitachi swallowed, her voice quieter now. We lived in a small apartment after that. My mother worked 3 jobs just to keep us fed. She never remarried, never sought another life. All she did was pour every ounce of love she had into me. She made me feel like I was enough, even when the world told me I wasn't. Then, her grip tightened slightly on the glass. She died when I was 13. Boonruang stilled. She worked herself to death, Chitachi continued, her voice still unnervingly steady. She never said it, but I knew. She was exhausted, broken, and she never stopped believing that if she had just been able to give my father a son, none of it would have happened. A bitter smile flickered at the corner of her lips. Even after all these years, my father never once tried to find me. I don't exist to him. Silence hung between them, heavy, unspoken. Boonruang had heard countless stories of pain. He had seen betrayal, cruelty, the ways people could break one another for power, for greed. But this was different. Because despite all of it, Chitachi was still here. Whole, unshaken, alive. He finally spoke, his voice low. How did you survive that? She looked up then, her dark eyes meeting his with a quiet fire. Because I had God. Boonruang's jaw tightened. Chitachi leaned forward, her expression unwavering. I was alone. I was lost. I was a child without a family, without a home. I had every reason to believe I was worthless, that I had no purpose. But God never let me believe that. Every time I fell apart, He reminded me that I was more than what the world said I was, that I wasn't a mistake, that I wasn't abandoned. A sharp breath, He became my father when I had none." The weight of her words pressed against Boonruang's chest, unfamiliar and suffocating. Faith. That was what she was talking about. The thing he had always dismissed, the thing he had never understood. She had lost everything, and yet she still believed. She wasn't broken. She wasn't bitter. She was stronger than anyone he had ever met. For the first time in his life, Boonruang didn't know what to say, and for the first time in his life, he wished he did. The walls of the Thanasan Empire had already begun to crack. Boonruang had known this from the moment he took his father's place, but he had never expected the knife to come from the one person he trusted most. The revelation came quietly, a whispered truth buried in a pile of lies, a late-night audit report. A confidential document slipped onto his desk, a quiet warning from an insider who still had a shred of loyalty left. Boonruang read the names on the report twice, then a third time, his stomach twisting into something unrecognizable. It couldn't be. The signature at the bottom of the falsified financial records belonged to someone he had trusted with his life. His father's right-hand man. His right-hand man. Krit. Krit, who had stood beside Somchair for decades. Krit, who had promised Boonruang that he would stand beside him just the same. Krit, who had been more than just an advisor. He had been family. And now he was the traitor. Boonruang stared at the papers in his hand. The proof of Krit's deception laid bare before him. Stolen funds, forged contracts, secret meetings with rival board members. The man he had trusted most had been orchestrating his downfall from the very beginning. Boonruang clenched his fists, his vision blurring with something he refused to name: rage, betrayal, grief. He had spent his entire life preparing for enemies, but not this one. The air in the boardroom was cold, the silence stretching like a blade waiting to be drawn. Krit sat across from him, calm, unreadable, the same way he always had. But now, Boonruang saw the mask for what it was. He pushed the documents across the table. "Explain." Krit glanced down, his expression barely shifting. "You already know the answer." Boonruang's jaw clenched. "I want to hear you say it." Krit exhaled, leaning back in his chair as if they were discussing an insignificant business deal. That hurt more than the betrayal itself. "You were never supposed to lead, Boonruang," Krit said finally. His voice was even, measured, like a teacher explaining a lesson to a student too naive to understand. "Everyone knew it. Even your father, deep down, must have known it." The word struck like a physical blow. Boonruang's breath hitched, but he masked it quickly, refusing to give this man, this traitor, the satisfaction. Krit continued, his voice carrying the weight of years of hidden resentment. "You think because Somchair loved you, he made the right choice? Love doesn't build empires. Strength does. And you, Boonruang, you were never strong enough." Boonruang felt the burn in his chest, but he refused to show it. "You were his closest advisor, his most trusted ally." His voice dropped lower, the pain bleeding through the cracks. "You were my most trusted ally." Krit didn't flinch. "Your father built something too big for a boy to handle. If I hadn't stepped in, this empire would have collapsed under your incompetence." Boonruang's hands curled into fists beneath the table. "So you stole from the company? You worked against me? You betrayed my father's legacy?" Krit smiled then, smiled. "Your father's legacy was power," he said, voice smooth as silk, "and power belongs to those who take it." Boonruang stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the marble floor. "Get out!" Krit didn't move. Boonruang's voice dropped, dangerously quiet. "You are finished. Your name, your influence, everything you built will be erased from this company, from this city, from this empire. I will make sure of it." Krit finally stood, adjusting his cufflinks as though none of this concerned him. Then, He met Boonruang's gaze with something almost amused. "You can try." And then he walked out, leaving Boonruang standing alone, watching everything he had once believed in turn to dust. That night, in the cold emptiness of his estate, Boonruang sat in his father's old study, staring at the flickering city lights through the window. He had lost everything: his allies, liars, his board, corrupt, his own family, waiting for him to fall. And now, even Krit, the one person he had trusted, had turned against him. For the first time in his life, Boonruang felt completely and utterly alone. No one to turn to, no one to trust, no one to catch him if he fell. The walls of the empire his father built were closing in, and if he didn't find a way to fight back, they would bury him in it. The city pulsed with life, but Boonruang felt like he was moving through a world that no longer recognized him. His body was exhausted, but his mind refused to rest, caught in an endless loop of failures, betrayals, and the suffocating weight of an empire he could no longer hold together. He had spent the past few nights in his estate, locked in silence, drowning under the ghosts of his father's expectations. He had barely eaten, barely slept. The mirror had shown him a stranger, his suit wrinkled, his once sharp gaze dull, his composure crumbling. And yet, no one noticed, or perhaps no one cared, except her. Boonruang found himself walking to the market before he could stop himself, feet dragging as if pulled by something unseen. He had no reason to go there, nothing to say, but still, he went, because she was the only person who made him feel real. When Chitachi saw him, her smile vanished. She took one look at his disheveled appearance, at the dark circles under his eyes, the exhaustion weighing down his frame, and knew something was wrong. She didn't ask. She didn't pry. She simply led him to a quiet spot by the river, away from the noise of the city, and sat beside him. The silence stretched between them. Then, quietly, Boonruang spoke. "They betrayed me." The words felt foreign on his tongue, bitter and raw. He had never admitted weakness to anyone, but with Chitachi, it felt different. She waited, patient as always, letting him unravel at his own pace. "My own people, my own family, they want to tear me down, and His voice caught, and he clenched his fists. "I don't know if I can stop them. I don't know if I'm strong enough." Chitachi was quiet for a moment, then said, "That reminds me of King Solomon." Boonruang frowned, glancing at her. "Who?" She smiled slightly. "A king from the Bible. He was young, just like you. He inherited a throne too big for him. His own family wanted power. He felt the weight of an entire kingdom on his shoulders. But instead of trying to do it alone, he asked God for help, and God gave him wisdom that made him one of the greatest rulers in history." Boonruang stared at her. "And you think I should do the same?" Chitachi met his gaze, unshaken. "I think you don't have to go through this alone." Something in his chest twisted. Alone. That word had defined his life since the moment his father died. Chitachi reached out and took his hand, not demanding, not forcing, just offering. "I'm going to pray for you," she said softly. He almost pulled away, almost told her not to, but he didn't. She closed her eyes, her grip warm and steady. "God, I lift up Boonruang to you. He's tired. He's broken. He's carrying burdens too heavy for one person to bear. But Lord, I know you see him. I know you love him. I ask that you give him strength where he feels weak, wisdom where he feels lost, and peace where he feels turmoil. Let him know that he is not alone, that he is not abandoned, that you are with him, always, in Jesus' name." Silence followed. Boonruang didn't move. His chest felt tight. as if something had shifted inside him, something he couldn't explain. He had spent his whole life believing in power, wealth, control. But now, for the first time, he wondered if he had spent his entire life chasing things that meant nothing. He looked at Chitachi, the girl who had nothing, yet carried herself as if she had everything. Maybe, just maybe. He had been searching for the wrong thing all along. The Bible sat on his nightstand for 3 days, untouched. Boonruang wasn't sure why he had kept it. He could have easily tossed it aside, buried it under the weight of the business reports and financial forecasts that consumed his life. But he didn't. Instead, he found himself staring at it each night as he lay in bed, unable to sleep. Chitachi hadn't forced him. She hadn't pushed, hadn't demanded. She had simply handed it to him with a small smile and said, "Whenever you're ready." But what did ready even mean? Boonruang had spent his entire life chasing things he could see: wealth, power, control. He had built walls around himself so high that no one could reach him, not even those who claimed to stand by his side, and yet he had never felt more lost. His empire was rotting from the inside. His father's name was being dragged through deception and greed. He had trusted the wrong people, and now he had no one left to trust. But Chitachi, she was different. She had nothing, yet she carried herself as if she had everything. She had no wealth, no throne, no legacy to uphold, just her faith. And somehow, that was enough. Why? The question gnawed at him, refusing to leave his mind. That night, unable to ignore the weight in his chest, he finally reached for the book. The leather binding was smooth beneath his fingers, the pages crisp, untouched. It felt foreign in his hands, yet strangely familiar. He exhaled sharply, flipping it open. At first, he skimmed through random passages, barely absorbing the words. But then, he searched for Solomon. 1 Kings 3:7-9. Now, Lord my God, you have made your servant king in place of my father David, but I am only a little child and do not know how to carry out my duties. Boonruang's grip on the book tightened. So give your servant a discerning heart to govern your people and to distinguish between right and wrong. He read it again, then again. Solomon had everything, just like him: a kingdom, wealth, power. But when he had the chance to ask God for anything, he hadn't asked for riches. He had asked for wisdom. A slow, unsteady breath left Boonruang's lips. His entire life, he had been taught that power meant control, that wealth meant security, that failure meant weakness. But what if he had been wrong? What if power wasn't about crushing those who opposed him? What if wealth wasn't about how much he could take, but how much he could give? What if true strength wasn't about standing alone, but knowing when to ask for help? His hands trembled slightly as he closed the Bible. He had spent years mastering the language of business, of negotiation, of dominance. But the words he had just read, they spoke a language he had never known. And for the first time in his life, he found himself wondering if maybe, just maybe, he had been looking for answers in all the wrong places. The Thanasan Empire had been built on strength, but it had been rotting from within. Boonruang had spent months watching the cracks widen, watching deception take root in the very foundation his father had built. Now he was done watching. It was time to clean house. The morning after Boonruang finished reading about Solomon, he walked into the headquarters of the Thanasan Corporation with a different energy. Gone was the weary air drowning under the weight of betrayal. Gone was the young man desperate for approval. In his place stood a leader who had decided that his father's empire would not be stolen from him, decided that he would fight for what was his, decided that he would build something greater, not through fear, but through integrity. It started small: a memo, a restructuring of key departments, A quiet audit launched behind closed doors. But then came the real war. One by one, the corrupt executives were exposed. Krit had been the first traitor to fall, but he wasn't the only one. Boonruang dug deep, following the paper trails, listening to whispers, watching. The CFO, embezzling funds, gone. The head of legal, leaking confidential information to a rival conglomerate, gone. A longtime board member, caught colluding to oust Boonruang behind the scenes, erased. He wasn't reckless. He wasn't emotional. He was strategic. Each removal was calculated, documented, airtight. No loose ends, no escape routes. The boardroom, once a nest of hidden threats, became his battlefield. And Boonruang, he was winning. But purging corruption was only half the battle. Boonruang knew that power alone meant nothing if he was still surrounded by people waiting for him to fail. He needed new blood. People who had no ties to the old ways. People who weren't bound by the greed and deception that had poisoned the empire. So, he sought them out. He recruited young minds, sharp, innovative, untainted by the legacy of his father's reign. Financial analysts with no political loyalties. Legal experts with reputations built on principle, not payoffs. Executives from outside industries who brought vision instead of corruption. And then, the biggest shock to the old guard, he brought in outsiders. People no one in his world would have ever considered. People like Chitachi. He knew the moment he asked her that she would be hesitant. "I don't belong in your world, Boonruang," she had said, crossing her arms as they stood by the river one evening. "I don't have the experience. I'm just a student." But Boonruang had learned something far more valuable than experience. "You have something they don't," he told her. "Integrity, a moral compass. People trust you. I trust you. And right now, I need people I can trust." She studied him for a long moment, searching his face. Then, finally, she sighed, shaking her head with a small smile. "All right, King Solomon," she teased. "Let's build you an empire worth keeping." Slowly, the tides began to shift. The media, which had once painted him as an unfit heir drowning in scandal, now watched him with cautious intrigue. The company, once unstable and divided, began to rebuild. The investors, once skeptical and restless, took notice. And Boonruang? He was no longer just surviving. He was leading. Not with the cold, calculated fear his enemies had expected, not with the ruthless efficiency they had tried to force on him, but with wisdom, with strength, with clarity. And for the first time since his father's death, he finally saw the truth. This empire was no longer just his father's legacy, it was his own. Boonruang had spent his life mastering control. Every decision was calculated, every emotion buried, every weakness hidden behind an impenetrable wall. But faith was something he could not control. And yet, here he was, sitting in the back of a small, humble church in the outskirts of Bangkok, far from the towering skyscrapers and the polished boardrooms, far from the wealth and power that had defined his existence. Here, no one knew him. No one saw an heir, a CEO, or a man carrying the weight of an empire on his shoulders. Here, he was just Boonruang. The soft hum of worship music filled the space, blending with the scent of old wooden pews and faint incense. The people around him swayed, eyes closed, hands lifted, their voices filled with something Boonruang had never understood: peace. Chitachi sat beside him, silent but present. She hadn't pushed him to come. She hadn't forced him into belief. She had simply shown him what faith looked like. And now, for the first time in his life, he wanted to know more. Boonruang had spent weeks reading the Bible in secret, drawn to the stories of men who had carried power. and the burdens that came with it. Moses, who had led a nation despite his own insecurities. Joseph, who had been betrayed by his own brothers, yet rose to greatness. And Solomon, the king who had asked not for riches or power, but for wisdom. But the one lesson he struggled with the most was forgiveness. Forgiveness was weakness. It meant lowering his guard, leaving himself open to betrayal again. Why should he forgive those who tried to destroy him? Why should he let go of the anger burning inside him? But the more he read, the more he saw a different kind of power, the kind that didn't come from crushing one's enemies, but from rising above them. And so, one evening, he made a decision. He picked up his phone and called the last person he ever thought he would. The meeting was set in a private tea house, away from the public eye. Boonruang arrived early, his hands steady, his mind clear. Then she walked in, his aunt, the woman who had spent years whispering poison into the ears of board members, the one who had sought to replace him, who had tried to strip him of everything his father had built. She sat across from him, guarded, waiting for a fight. Instead, he poured her tea. "I know what you did," Boonruang said calmly. "I know about the meetings, the forged documents, the votes you tried to manipulate." She tensed. "If you called me here to threaten me..." "I called you here to forgive you," Boonruang said. Silence. She stared at him, as if trying to decipher a trick, a hidden motive. But there was none. "I spent months hating you," Boonruang admitted, his voice steady, "wanting to see you suffer the way you made me suffer. But I've realized something." He exhaled, placing his hands on the table. "If I hold on to that anger, I become no different from you." Her eyes flickered. A muscle in her jaw tensed. "I won't let you back into my life," Boonruang continued. "I won't trust you, but I won't hate you either." Another pause. Then, something Boonruang never expected. Her eyes glistened. "I only did what I thought was best," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. "Your father, he gave you everything. And the rest of us? We were left with nothing." Boonruang studied her for a long moment. Then, quietly, he said, "I hope one day you find what you're looking for." She looked away, her hands trembling slightly as she lifted her cup. And Boonruang? For the first time in his life, he felt lighter. That night, as he walked the quiet streets of Bangkok, he called Chitachi. "You were right," he said. She laughed softly. "About what?" "Forgiveness," he admitted. "It's not weakness. It's release." Chitachi smiled through the phone. "That's grace, Boonruang, and it's only the beginning." He glanced up at the night sky, the weight on his shoulders finally easing. For the first time, he understood. Power was not about control. Strength was not about standing alone. And healing. Healing began with letting go. The city had long since quieted, the market streets empty, the neon lights of Bangkok casting a faint glow against the water as Boonruang and Chitachi walked along the Chao Phraya River. The world around them felt still, just the sound of the waves lapping against the docks, the occasional hum of a distant boat passing by. Boonruang had never been the type to talk, not about himself, not about the things that made his chest feel tight, the things he buried under the weight of expectation. Weakness was a luxury he had never been allowed, but tonight, he couldn't hold it in. He came to a stop by the railing, gripping the metal as he exhaled slowly. Chitachi stopped beside him, waiting, patient as always. She never pushed, never demanded. She simply stood beside him, ready to listen when he was ready to speak. And somehow, that made it easier. "I don't remember her face," he finally admitted, his voice quieter than usual. Not fully, just pieces of it. Her smile, the way she used to hum when she cooked, the scent of jasmine oil in her hair. Chitachi turned to him, her gaze softening. Boonruang swallowed hard. I was 6 when she died. They never talk about her. Not in the house, not in the family. It's like she never existed. But I remember the way my father looked after she was gone. How he never spoke of her. But I knew, he exhaled sharply. I knew she was the one thing he never got over. Chitachi reached for his hand, her fingers warm against his own. And you? Boonruang let out a hollow chuckle. I was too young to understand what grief was. I just knew that one day she was there, and the next she wasn't. I used to think if I worked hard enough, if I became the perfect son, my father would look at me and not see the part of him that died with her. He shook his head. But I was never enough. Not for him. Not for anyone. Chitachi squeezed his hand, grounding him. That's not true. Boonruang met her gaze, and for the first time, he let someone see the parts of him he kept locked away. His anger, his fear, his loneliness, and she didn't flinch. She didn't look at him with pity or with judgment. She just held on to him, unwavering, unshaken. You don't have to be enough for anyone else, Boonruang, she said softly. You just have to be enough for yourself. He swallowed the lump in his throat, something breaking inside him, something heavy. No one had ever told him that before. Chitachi reached up, brushing her fingers against his jaw in the lightest of touches. You don't have to do this alone, she whispered. Boonruang closed his eyes for a moment, letting himself breathe. And when he opened them, he realized something. He trusted her, more than he had trusted anyone in his life. And maybe, just maybe, that meant he wasn't alone anymore. The storm had been brewing for months. Boonruang had known that the moment his enemies sensed weakness, they would strike. The vultures had been circling, waiting for the perfect moment to tear apart the empire his father built. And now, that moment had come. It started with whispers in the financial world, leaks about instability in the Thanison Corporation, investors pulling out, executives resigning. Then came the official offer, a hostile takeover bid from a rival conglomerate, a ruthless powerhouse that had been waiting for this exact moment to devour everything his family had built. The media went wild. Analysts predicted Boonruang would fall. The boardroom was divided, some members swayed by fear, others already conspiring to sell their shares. They thought he was weak. They thought he was alone. They were wrong. Boonruang had spent months preparing for this, silently, relentlessly. While his enemies thought he was licking his wounds, he had been studying them, outmaneuvering them, and now he was ready. The morning of the emergency board meeting, he entered the skyscraper headquarters of Thanison Corporation not as a desperate heir, but as a man who had reclaimed his throne. His steps were firm, his suit sharp, his gaze lethal. The enemy representatives sat across from him, their smirks thinly veiled. They thought they had already won. They were about to learn otherwise. Boonruang took his seat at the head of the long obsidian table, his voice calm, measured. I assume you've come to negotiate. The rival CEO leaned forward. Not negotiate. Conclude. A smirk. It's over, Boonruang. You lost the moment your board lost faith in you. Boonruang didn't blink. You're right. My board did lose faith, but that doesn't mean I did. With deliberate precision, he slid a document across the table. A merger agreement. But not with them. The rival CEO's smirk faltered as he read the details. Another conglomerate, one even larger, more powerful and more ruthless than theirs, had signed a last-minute alliance with Boonruang. A partnership that secured Thanison Corporation's dominance while shutting them out completely. It wasn't just a defense move, it was checkmate. The rival executive's jaw tightened. Impossible! Boonruang leaned back, his expression unreadable. You assumed I was playing your game. I wasn't. Silence fell over the boardroom as realization set in. The takeover had failed, and Boonruang had won. The media hailed it as one of the greatest corporate turnarounds in Thailand's history. Boonruang Thanasin, the once doubted heir, had crushed his enemies without breaking a sweat. But to him, it was more than a victory. It was proof. Proof that he was not his father. He didn't need to be. Proof that power wasn't just about control, but about wisdom. Proof that he had built something greater than an empire. He had built a future. And for the first time, when he looked in the mirror, he saw a leader. The press conference was set to be the defining moment of Boonruang's leadership. The world was watching. Cameras lined the room, flashing relentlessly as reporters jotted down notes, waiting for a statement that would determine the fate of the Thanasin Empire. The headlines had already written him off. A fallen dynasty? Thanasin Empire in freefall? Young Heir crumbles under pressure. This wasn't just about business anymore. It was about legacy, about trust, about proving, once and for all, that he was not a puppet, not a weak link, not a man drowning in his father's shadow. Boonruang stood at the podium, impeccably dressed, his expression composed. But there was something different in his eyes. Not arrogance, not desperation, conviction. He exhaled, gripping the edges of the podium before addressing the room. I won't pretend I didn't struggle. The room fell silent. No scripted denials, no empty reassurances, just truth. When I took over this empire, I thought I was prepared. I thought I understood the weight of the responsibility my father left me. I was wrong. A pause. The weight of honesty hung in the air. I have made mistakes. I have trusted the wrong people. I have underestimated the forces working against me. But if there is one thing I have learned, he lifted his gaze, voice unwavering, it is that strength is not measured by how much power you hold, but by how much truth you are willing to stand in. A murmur rippled through the crowd. This company was built on a foundation of resilience. My father created an empire that has stood the test of time, and I will not allow corruption, greed, or fear to dismantle it. His voice grew stronger, steadier, unshakable. Transparency will not be a slogan. It will be our standard. Innovation will not be a trend. It will be our legacy. Integrity will not be an option. It will be our foundation. The reporters scribbled furiously, recording every word. I know the doubt that surrounds me. I know what's been said about me. He let the words sink in, meeting the gaze of every person in the room. But today, I stand before you not as the son of Somcher Thanasin, but as Boonruang Thanasin, a leader in my own right, a leader who has fought, who has fallen, but who has risen again. A pause, a breath. This company will not fall. His final words rang through the hall like a declaration of war. By the time he stepped down from the podium, the energy in the room had shifted. This wasn't the defeated heir they had expected. This was a man who had reclaimed his empire. The press headlines changed overnight. Boonruang Thanasin, the rise of a new era. From crisis to control, how the young CEO defied the odds. Thanasin Corporation's future is secure, and it has its leader to thank. Investors returned. Stakeholders took notice. And the world finally saw what Boonruang himself had taken so long to realize. He wasn't just surviving, he was leading. The boardroom was packed, but this time it wasn't with wolves. Executives, stakeholders, and high-ranking officials sat at the long obsidian table, waiting for Boonruang to speak. The weight of his recent victory still lingered in the air, a shift in power. A silent acknowledgement that he was no longer just Somcher's son. He was the man who had rebuilt the empire from the ashes. But today, it wasn't just about power. It was about purpose. Boonruang took his place at the head of the table, but this time he wasn't alone. Standing beside him, poised yet unshaken by the stares of Thailand's most powerful elites, was Chitachi. The murmurs began immediately. Who was she? The young woman who had stood at the periphery of Boonruang's life? Never officially acknowledged, until now. Boonruang let them whisper for a moment, then spoke. For too long, this empire has been built on one thing: wealth. But wealth without impact is meaningless. The room fell silent. In my journey to reclaim my father's legacy, I realized something. Legacy isn't just about power. It's about what we leave behind. It's about the people we lift up, the communities we serve. His gaze shifted, locking onto the faces of men and women who had spent decades chasing profits, many of whom had betrayed him in their pursuit of more. Today, we begin a new chapter, he continued, his voice steady, a chapter that will not only secure our future, but redefine our purpose. He turned slightly, his attention shifting to Chitachi, and I wouldn't have reached this realization without someone who challenged me to see beyond my own world. Gasps rippled through the room as he gestured toward her. This is Chitachi Matthew. His voice didn't waver. She has been my closest confidant, my most trusted advisor, and together, we are launching an initiative that will transform the way we do business. Chitachi stepped forward, her presence unwavering, her voice clear. We will be reinvesting into the very people who built this empire. We will create scholarships for underprivileged youth, mentorship programs for young entrepreneurs, and infrastructure projects to uplift the communities our businesses operate in. Boonruang added, this isn't about charity. It's about responsibility, about recognizing that the success of an empire means nothing if the people around it remain in struggle. The reaction was mixed: shock, curiosity, skepticism. But there was also something else in the air: respect. Because this was no longer just a corporate leader speaking. This was a man with vision, a man who had learned that true power isn't just about what you take, but about what you give. After the meeting, as the room emptied and the murmurs faded, Boonruang and Chitachi remained behind, standing by the floor-to-ceiling window overlooking the city. You really did that, she murmured, glancing at him with a small smile. He chuckled, hands in his pockets. We did. A beat of silence. Then, softer, more vulnerable. I wouldn't have made it here without you. Chitachi looked up at him, her gaze searching his. You always had it in you, Boonruang. You just needed someone to remind you that you weren't alone. And his heart tightened. For so long, he had carried everything. The weight of expectations, of betrayal, of an empire that nearly consumed him. But with her, he didn't have to carry it alone anymore. Boonruang reached out, gently taking her hand. Their fingers intertwined, a silent promise. A new beginning. Not just for the company, for them. The city stretched before him, endless and vast, its skyline a glittering reflection of the empire he had fought to reclaim. Boonruang stood on the balcony of his estate, the wind cool against his skin, the weight of everything he had endured pressing down on him one last time. The betrayals, the battles, the losses, the victories. And yet, something was still missing. For years, he had believed that power was enough, that control was strength, that standing alone was survival. But now, he knew better. He exhaled, running his hand over the Bible Chitachi had given him all those weeks ago. At first, it had been a curiosity, then a source of wisdom. Now, it was something more. He turned the pages slowly, his eyes scanning the verses that had lingered in his mind since the first night he read them. Matthew 11:28. Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest." He clenched his jaw, staring at the words. For so long, he had carried everything alone. His father's expectations, his family's betrayal, his own crushing self-doubt. But what if he didn't have to? What if there was a different kind of strength? One that didn't come from power, but from surrender. Boonruang closed his eyes, and for the first time in his life, he let go. Let go of the belief that he had to be in control of everything. Let go of the anger that had fueled him for so long. Let go of the fear that he would never be enough. And in that moment, standing under the night sky, he prayed. Not with practiced words, not with formality, but with honesty. "God, I don't know what I'm doing. I don't even know if I'm worthy of this. But if you're really there, I don't want to do this alone anymore. I can't do this alone anymore." A breath, a pause, and then something he had never felt before. Peace. A quiet stillness settled in his chest, filling the emptiness that wealth and power never could. He opened his eyes, exhaling slowly, and for the first time, he didn't feel like he was falling. He felt like he was finally free. The Thanasan Empire had been reborn. Once plagued by corruption, deception, and greed, it now stood as a testament to resilience, wisdom, and purpose. Boonruang sat at the head of the boardroom, no longer a man weighed down by shadows, but one who had learned to walk through them. He led not with fear, but with integrity, not with arrogance, but with humility. His name, once spoken with doubt, was now respected. His leadership, once questioned, was now unshakable. He was no longer the lost heir trying to prove himself. He was the man he was always meant to be. And through it all, she remained by his side. Chitachi had become more than just his confidant, more than just his anchor. She was his home. When the weight of responsibility grew heavy, she reminded him of the faith that carried him. When the world questioned his choices, she stood by him without hesitation. When he doubted himself, she reminded him of the man he had become. With her, he found clarity. With her, he found peace. With her, he found a future worth fighting for. The sun was setting over the Bangkok skyline, the golden hues of dusk casting a soft glow over the world. Boonruang and Chitachi stood on the balcony of his home, the city stretching out before them. A city they had helped shape, not just through business, but through impact, scholarships, infrastructure, philanthropy. The empire his father built was now more than just a monument to power. It was a force for good. Chitachi leaned against the railing, watching the sunset with a soft smile. "Did you ever think we'd end up here?" Boonruang turned to her, his gaze full of something deeper than admiration. Gratitude. "No," he admitted. "But now, I can't imagine anywhere else." She looked up at him, her eyes warm. "And do you still think you have to do everything alone?" He exhaled a quiet chuckle, taking her hand in his. "Not anymore." A breeze passed through, carrying the scent of jasmine, the sound of the city alive with possibilities. Boonruang lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a soft kiss against her knuckles. A silent promise. A promise of strength. A promise of faith. A promise of forever. And as the city lights flickered to life, they stood together, a king and his guiding light, ready to build a future greater than either of them had ever imagined. The legacy was no longer just his father's, it was theirs. The sun had begun its descent over Bangkok, painting the sky in streaks of gold and crimson. The city shimmered in the distance, but Boonruang saw none of it. His world was standing before him. Chitachi. She had been the one constant in his storm, the light in his darkest nights, the voice of reason when he had none, the quiet strength that reminded him he was never alone. And now, looking at her, he knew one thing with absolute certainty. He never wanted to live a day without her. They stood on the terrace of his home, the evening breeze wrapping around them like a whisper of something divine. Boonruang exhaled, his heart beat steady, his decision already made. He took her hands, warmth meeting warmth, fingers lacing together as if they had always belonged. "Chitachi," he murmured, his voice raw with emotion, "will you be my wife?" She inhaled sharply, her dark eyes widening, shimmering with unshed tears. For a moment, she said nothing, but then she smiled, the kind of smile that felt like home. "Yes, Boonruang, yes." And just like that, the final piece of his life clicked into place. Their wedding was not a display of wealth, nor a spectacle for the world to witness. It was a covenant, a moment of quiet vows, spoken before God and those who mattered most. A promise not just between two hearts, but between them and the one who had brought them together. Boonruang had spent years believing in power, control, and self-reliance. Now, he believed in something greater. He believed in God. He believed in love. And most of all, he believed that Chitachi was his answered prayer. One evening, long after the celebrations had faded and the world had settled into its quiet rhythms, Boonruang sat beside his wife, watching her in the golden glow of their home. For years, he had searched for meaning in all the wrong places, but now, sitting here, he had everything he had ever needed. Chitachi caught him staring and raised an eyebrow, smiling. "What?" Boonruang exhaled, his voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you for coming into my life." She didn't hesitate. She took his hand, her fingers squeezing his gently, her voice filled with the quiet certainty he had always admired. "No, Boonruang, I thank God for helping us meet." His throat tightened, because she was right. This wasn't chance. This wasn't luck. This was the Lord's doing. And as he kissed her hand, resting his forehead against hers, he whispered the words that had once seemed impossible for him to say, "Amen." The end. What did you learn from this story? Share your thoughts in the comments section below. Please leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on post notifications so you never miss an update. Don't forget to share this video with someone who would love it. Thank you so much for watching.